Andrew Keane. You're Director of NexSys and the Energy Institute at University College Dublin. NexSys is a major all-island research programme where you're targeting the development of credible pathways to a net zero carbon energy system. You previously served as Head of School of Electrical and Electronic Engineering at UCD and held positions in industry with the ESB networks in Dublin and Smarter Grid Solutions in Glasgow. In 2015, you co-founded NovaGrid, a grid automation company. You're a senior member of the IEEE. So thanks so much for talking to us today. And before, I'm really fascinated by this conversation today and that whole idea around the journey to net zero, which is so crucial. But before we get into that, would you mind telling us a little bit about your journey and how you got to where you are today and the work you're doing today?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm, as you mentioned, I'm an electrical engineer by background and by discipline. Did my engineering degree at UCD and then subsequently did my PhD there. And then kind of through my PhD, it was in the integration of renewable energy around the kind of mid-2000s. So in relative terms, quite an early stage in that kind of industry and that development, albeit it felt like quite a lot was happening even at that stage. Was in the University of Edinburgh for a while as a postdoc and then came back to UCD and was lucky enough to get a faculty position there. And through that period, I've been kind of building my research in this area of electrical networks, with the focus pretty much being on decarbonisation and with electricity being a fairly central element of how we can actually decarbonise the system.
Yeah. And I suppose in that context then tell us a bit about NexSys. I mean, people might not necessarily know what it is and what's involved. Is it like 42 academics?
Yeah, so it's an all-island program hosted from UCD and led by myself, but all island. So we have, I won't try and list all the universities here on the spot because I always leave one out, but we have Ulster University and Queen's University Belfast, and we're very proud of that all-island aspect of the program. We think it's important. The system in Ireland, the electricity system, is an all-island system. It makes a lot of sense from all angles, we think, to kind of pursue this in an all-island nature. But what NexSys is about, as you mentioned, is around pathways to net zero energy system. So in some respects, we can talk a lot about, well, we need more renewables, wind and solar, and we can kind of imagine what that might look like at some time in the future. But there's a need for real deep research to kind of try and identify what is the pathway to actually getting there, to actually make that system work. And work reliably and securely. And obviously lately, very unfortunately, with the war in Ukraine, we've had to reflect very seriously on our energy security and the role that system plays in terms of the fabric of our society and the cost of energy as well. So it's trying to get to that net zero mission or achieve that while at the same time, maintaining kind of the ability of the system to deliver what it needs for a society.
And and tell us a little bit more about that and the kind of research that's going on within that.
So it's engineering led. So it's a lot of work on the grid itself, electrical engineering, looking at that grid, which is it can be unstable. It's a very dynamic system, and it's a system that spans across countries and continents, right down into every home business in the country. So in a way, it's a massive circuit, I guess. But understanding how can we actually operate that system reliably. But also it's about much more than just the engineering. It's also about how can we operate that system reliably, but equally, how can we actually achieve the integration of electric vehicles and heat pumps? And immediately you can start to think about the engineering challenges that might go with that, and that's a focus of my own research. But there's a big issue around the societal transition that needs to take place, and that is underway at the moment. So when you look at the energy transition, there's a technical piece, which is really important, and there's a need for kind of long-term basic research to kind of help accelerate and progress that. But there's also a need to look at it from different angles. So there's a need for energy economics, there's a need for environmental psychology, how we finance this. I mean, the list goes on. And it's that multidisciplinary approach which doesn't often naturally happen within our system, within the universities, to really promote that. And that's been a big focus of what I've been doing as director of the Institute for several years, is trying to reach across disciplinary boundaries and trying to learn the language of a social scientist, of an economist, and for them to learn the language of engineers, mathematicians, computer scientists. So there's an overhead, it takes time, but it's really invaluable and really worthwhile, and in my view, essential.
And tell me more about that whole interdisciplinary area. I mean, I think you're working with people like the ESRI, am I right? Or, tell us more about the kind of people on the...
Absolutely, yes. So there's obviously people in the School of Economics in UCD, but then the ESRI are one of the core partners of the program itself. So obviously, Economic and Social Research Institute, they're looking at energy policy. They're feeding information into government, providing analysis out to society on what this looks like. So again, it's a really good example of engineering analysis and engineering research, which would often be quite policy relevant, but maybe not on first look. And there's a whole section of work which, if it was just engineering, would kind of be left undone. And our view was that's just a missed opportunity, and that there's a bridging piece to actually not just translate the outputs of the engineering research or the scientific outputs, but also then to actually have that real, genuine, economic research in their discipline, which draws on the engineering outputs. And it's kind of a two-way street, I suppose. But it can be really valuable, and it also helps make the case for why we exist, why we should be funded, and our contribution to society, which is a big part of what we're about.
And I mean, are you optimistic about the future, about that transition? Tell me your thoughts on where we're at.
I'm a bit of an optimist in general, right?
You have to
I
be,
suppose.
don't you?
Maybe. I think there's a lot of challenges, I would say. I think everyone and I would talk about the need for accelerating the transition, which is very much the case. But I think, again, I'm a technology optimist. I really believe in the power and potential for technology to be for the good of society, and I think there's lots of things. And actually, I think the power grid, as one of the largest, most complex human-made systems ever, has had a huge societal transformation in terms of the supply of electricity. And if you look at the parts of the world where they don't have a grid, it's literally like night and day, I think, not just in technical terms, but in the societal terms as well. So back to your question then, it's a question of, well, yes, we have technology. Electric vehicles are real and have matured. Heat pumps are real and have matured. Solar panels, onshore wind turbines. So we have a lot of the technologies we need to achieve the short-term goals. The challenges we have, and the reason I'm less of an optimist, is that it requires that societal transition, that all-sector effort, which is kind of a transformational thing to take place. And I think that's where we're seeing the difficulties. And that's not really an engineering challenge.
No.
It's not really within my core discipline area, but in terms of what NexSys is considering, it's really kind of central to it, to try and understand, well, actually, how do we actually progress things?
And I mean, you need to look at the area of transforming sectors, entire sectors. And what are the sectors that we have seen being transformed?
So I think we've seen really good progress in electricity. So if you think about energy usage, there's three main components. There's electricity, there's heat, and there's transport. So in Irish terms, and it reflects elsewhere in terms of decarbonisation, in heat and transport, we haven't seen that much progress at all. It's reflected in our achievement of our 2020 targets in the past in this country. Electricity was the one shining light, as I've spoken about before elsewhere, whereby we pretty much achieved our target of 40% renewable electricity. And that was through the deployment of onshore wind across the country. So that's good, that's great, but of course the issue is we can't just sit back, we need to then push ever further. So we now have the target of 80% renewable electricity on the island or in the country by 2030, which is a significantly ambitious target, technically possible, but for the reasons I've mentioned already, maybe it's going to be a challenge. And often I think that because we have the technology and electricity to achieve this decarbonisation, as a sector, it's been asked to kind of overachieve almost in policy terms and other sectors. A big piece of that a big piece of the decarbonisation is moving as much of the energy from transport and heat into electricity. Heat pumps, electric vehicles are the obvious go-to examples, right, that we would talk about. So that's part of what we do and relevant to what we do, but we're also looking longer term at this net zero goal. So we're looking at, well, actually, beyond 2030, this isn't going to stop, right? How can we decarbonise things like shipping? Aviation is going to be really difficult. So things like green hydrogen start to come into play, and it starts to become not just an electricity question, but it's a multi-energy question. So it's about gas as well. Hopefully green hydrogen, so low or zero carbon gas. But the transition to that is really complex and difficult, like in policy terms, but also in as an engineer in technical terms as well.
I think that area, the whole area of hydrogen and green hydrogen is fascinating. I'd love to hear a little bit more, even for some of our readers who don't really know what it involves. Could you tell us a little bit more about its possibilities?
Yeah, so it does have great possibilities. So the basic thing at play there is that you can, via electrolysis, take water, which is H2O, as people are familiar with, and then by driving electricity into it, you can separate it into the oxygen and the hydrogen. So there's no carbon in H2O, right? So that's how it's clean. the idea with green hydrogen must be that it would be renewable electricity that's used to split the water into hydrogen and oxygen. So then we have this green fuel, hydrogen, which can then be used. So that has really huge potential, I would say. The challenges are that it's just not as energy intensive as a lovely hydrocarbon, right? I'm only joking now, right? Such as methane or other things, petroleum products, where there's a huge amount of energy density within them. And a lot of it's around just the existing infrastructure. So the fossil fuel industry has developed an ability to extract these fuels, to transport them around, to pipe them into people's homes. So that's going to be the difficulty with that. There's difficulties around storing hydrogen, there's difficulty in the transport. But as you start to look at those, what I would call harder to abate sectors like aviation, shipping, heavy industry, there's a couple of other ones as well, of course. It's hard to see beyond things like hydrogen or maybe ammonia that it's not just going to be electricity. There's some things we just won't really be able to electrify. As I sometimes said before, we will need molecules, if you will, in the future as part of our energy mix, which is hopefully they're low carbon or zero carbon.
Yeah, and on the aviation side, I mean, aviation's probably one of the most challenging areas, and it's huge. And we've seen, you know, since the pandemic, that the number of flights going up and up and up again, and we're almost going back to where we were. I think there's a little bit less business flight, but what are the possibilities of decarbonising
well, it's still a little unclear, I would say, and I'm no particular expert in it, but a lot of talk about synthetic fuels now, whereby, again, you can use a kind of a green energy source like renewable electricity to, you know, generate or synthesize these kind of still kind of hydrocarbon fuels. So there still will be combustion at the end of the process. So that may be problematic, but at least along in the kind of the chain of the process, it will be low carbon. So those technologies have a lot of potential. The challenge, I suppose, is around the efficiency. In my view, with a lot of these things, with electricity, you generally have a great efficiency gain. So the way I would explain it would be anytime you have an energy conversion, so anytime you move from, you know, rotational moving energy into electricity, or any point like that, or electricity into hydrogen, or hydrogen into electricity, anytime you're converting something, you're having a loss of energy. And if you have all these steps in the chain, you're losing energy. So the efficiency of the whole process can be really undermining maybe the economics of it. But, you know, people have been burning all kinds of things in power plants around the world for lots of time. Thermal, which means a lot of stuff in heat. So there's been a lot of losses, you know, a lot of lack of efficiency for a long time. And that practice has persisted. So, you know, I always talk about the efficiency, but maybe that will just be. But this is the uncertain bit. This is what we're trying to chart. This is what we're trying to discover, right?
Yeah, so, yeah. We're talking about efficiency and everything, and I'm thinking about whether it's the international grid or the national grid. I mean, I'm assuming there's huge parts of the world that have aging grids. How big an issue is this?
Yeah, so I would say almost all parts of the world have aging grids. I mean, and I would kind of view it as almost a wonderful indicator of the grid and its robustness and reliability, that the equipment on the grid is often decades old, right? But it's still operating reliably. So that's a wonderful thing in my view. But the modernization of grids, the investment in grid infrastructure, the deployment of new technologies, for example, the rolling out of charging infrastructure will be an obvious one. The ongoing rollout of advanced metering, or smart meters as they will be known, is fairly essential to everything. So that's the piece that often gets ignored, I would say, or overlooked, that, you know, everywhere you see a wind turbine, or if you see a lot of electric vehicles, you see a lot of solar panels, the grid needs to be upgraded, which sounds obvious as I say it out loud, but it can be easily overlooked. Yeah. So this transformation of the grid, which is more closer to my core area and expertise and research, is really what's close to my heart, because, as I say, I think the power system is an amazing system, you know, one of the greatest innovations of the 20th century, and I now think obviously we're well into the 21st century, and seeing that transformation and how that grid and that system will evolve and need to modernize hugely, as I think you're suggesting, will be, you know, will provide me with lots of research questions for years to come. I suspect, happily. Yeah. For me, at least.
And I mean, but how challenging is it? I mean, it's a big challenge, I presume, to modernise these grids.
Yeah, no, it is hugely challenging. So in technical terms, there's kind of been, I suppose, the old grid, if we talk about that, would be big power stations burning coal, oil, gas, and the power flows down from these big stations through pylons and overhead lines down to homes and businesses, one direction. What we've seen, even from when I started my research career, is things are now connecting at a much more local level, closer to homes and businesses. So like wind turbines are actually at a much closer level to your home than the big power plants are. But electric vehicles, heat pumps, solar panels, all the things we're talking about, that's all happening at that local grid level. And those grids were not designed to accommodate these technologies. There's very little real-time measurement at all. So, the grid operators don't really know what's happening on those grids. They didn't have to know. The system was able to operate really reliably. It was wonderful engineering that they didn't need to have any measurements in real time. But now they increasingly do. So if you imagine that's just a fundamental almost flipping or inversion of the structure of the system. And it brings the consumer right into front and center of the grid as not just receivers of energy, but maybe playing a part in terms of demand side management. So again, something people talk a lot about is managing electric vehicle charging. And people could change their charging habits to be supportive of the grid. So this is there's a plethora of really interesting research questions. But there's going to be investment in the grid. We're going to need more wires and transformers. But there's also, of course, an ongoing digitization of the grid, I guess would be the kind of catch-all term for it, which means deployment of sensors, measurements, it means comms, it means having more access to information in real time. And a lot of the work I do is about what can we do with the measurements and sensors that we have? How can we minimize the need for those sensors, perhaps? And then you end up with quite large data sets. So you're drifting into data-driven AI, machine learning, these kinds of techniques. So like every sector, machine learning is being applied to it. Whether usefully or not is another question, but these are, we're seeing a massive explosion in the data sets available from the grid as part of this modernization.
And that AI side, the machine learning side, I mean, I presume it's going to be huge. I mean, because you're almost talking about to use the old expression, the Internet of Things, when you're talking about sensors and comms and everything. Yeah. So I'm assuming the kind of the machine learning around the data is going to be massive.
Absolutely it is. So, I mean, as I say, where there was just a complete absence of data, be it kind of in real time or otherwise, now there's a massive amount of data. So even just think of smart meters would be an obvious one that people would be familiar with. Like, so people's smart meters are now recording, I think, is it half-hourly data, which they can download. Now it's their data, but the data still, in theory, exists that could be used for research. So this is a massive data. There's a lot of sensors. So, and as we know from the modern machine learning and AI techniques that are available, you can do an awful lot with that. One of the challenges, I think, in the field at the moment is that, and one of the challenges I would say, certainly in engineering research in general, is there's a wealth of computational methods available to people. It's wonderful. It's so powerful. You can just go on and access a solver and access any technique. But for me as an engineer, it's always like, well, is it the right solution or the right tool to actually solve it? Do you just have a hammer and are you looking for nails all the time? So, there's great scope for, just kind of misapplication of these techniques. We've
talked a little bit about NexSys and the all-island approach, which is wonderful. It makes so much sense that when you say our electrification has an all-island approach anyway. But how does Ireland compete in this area of research? Is it like, are we players in this area? Is it, do we have a lot of international links? Do we work internationally with people?
So I think we are strong and very competitive internationally. For a variety of reasons. I think because we've been working in this area for some years, so like any area of research, it takes time to really develop quality and depth and to establish yourself. But Ireland, just as a country and almost by way of its geography, is a really interesting place to be doing this research. So we're an island where we're kind of a big enough grid to matter and be useful for others to learn from, but also small enough that it's actually possible to do things. So a big bit of what we do is industry-academic partnership. And in Ireland, we have a single transmission system operator, EirGrid. ESB are very big and dominant. We have Gas Networks Ireland. So, it's possible to work with the key players, and it's not tens of organizations, it's a smaller set. That's really helpful. It's also meant on the road to getting to 40% renewable electricity, the grid operator, EirGrid, were hitting challenges in terms of the operation of the grid that their counterparts internationally weren't hitting. So equally, we as academics and researchers here in Ireland were kind of getting access to data, research questions, unforeseen consequences before others were. So that gave us kind of a competitive advantage and allowed us to really do some research that you know, people hadn't even seen these problems, and we were trying to be solving some of these problems along the way. So in that respect, I think in that regard, there's a happy story of our industry kind of up to 2020 really leading the way in terms of integration of renewables, but also in our own way, in the academic world, our research also providing a leading contribution globally.
So as well as an academic background, of course you have a background in industry as well when you worked with ESB networks and also with smarter grid solutions. So tell me how that has impacted on your research, and I'm sure it's had an influence on your work.
Yeah, no, it has. It's always been something I've been interested in is that industry experience, or just seeing, you know, how things are approached and just how that operates almost. Yeah, so like as a young PhD student or as a researcher, you're doing research, you're making it as good as possible, and you're publishing papers. But I always had this kind of like nagging, like, okay, I've published a paper in the top journal, wonderful, people are citing it, this is amazing, but like almost like, where's the impact? Now that was probably just me being impatient, right, in my younger self. But I was like, well, I really want to go to industry and see, like, you know, and kind of like, why aren't you just using? This is somewhat naive. Or why aren't you just using my paper? Yeah. No, so that's slightly naive. But going into industry allowed me to see, like, oh, well, yeah, maybe they're not even reading my paper, which I kind of knew, of course. But also understand how they actually progress things, what their challenges were, and it was. But also over time, then to see actually how, you know, basic research, which is maybe longer term in its thinking, or is not addressing some kind of near-term business need, which is obviously fairly appropriate that it wouldn't be necessarily. Does actually make a contribution. It just takes a longer time. So I can see that now, maybe, you know, 10 years later, but I couldn't see it at the time. But going into industry, you could just maybe see directly, oh yeah, okay, this is their perspective. It's different. These are their challenges, and I could kind of understand why they weren't, which I kind of knew, but just knowing, and then there's seeing and doing and really knowing, if that makes sense at least. Yeah. And it kind of motivated me then around the company I co-founded called NovaGrid, because I was kind of thinking, well, yes, there's a contribution, but if I really think these solutions are as good as I privately think they are, right, maybe we just need to do it ourselves. So myself and a postdoc and another colleague co-founded this company, and that's still going. I always say, well, it's going 10 years later, so that's success for any small company at least. But so that was kind of me saying, well, actually, let's just directly try and implement something ourselves rather than relying on others to take it up.
And then back to academia. Why?
Well, I think because that's always where my heart is, really. I think, you know, teaching students, working with students is a big bit of me, and postdocs and others. And I just think it's such a privileged position, actually, that we have as academics in society, not just in Ireland and elsewhere. And it just gives you the opportunity to do a lot of things. So I was able to go to industry and come back. Yeah. I'm able to co-found a company, you know, and I'm able to also then teach students. So it just seems to me to be quite a privileged position in society that we hold, you know.
And has that industry experience influenced your research?
Yeah, it has. So, okay, in terms of networks and all the rest of people, it's certainly really helpful for that. But also to see, again, as I say, directly, what are the challenges, what's the mindset, but also allowed me to kind of, like, not just go, okay, that's what industry think, but also to actually kind of, okay, that's where they are, that's the challenge they have. What I think a big part of what my role and our role is, I think, is around, well, actually having some new ideas. Probably don't just say that aloud, but, you know, some new ideas, right, of how the system could operate, and not just to be constrained in by the industry experience and their perspective, but to understand how the new ideas that we might be kind of envisioning and then developing, you know, the research and methods around what that looks like are set against that industry experience. So it's just a really helpful piece of the jigsaw. I think that kind of probably rounds me out and others as you know. Yeah. But you know, everyone's path is different.
It is, of course. It just seems to make huge sense that, you know, to do both.
It did to me, at least. Yeah, and I was lucky enough to be able to. Yeah.
So I mean, a couple of short questions to finish up. I can't believe how fast the time has gone. I'm sure there's been many, but if you could pick a career highlight or more, is there something that stands out?
Gosh, I kind of, it's maybe more lately when I've kind of met some students at alumni events, and I'd kind of forgotten, because there were students in a class and they're like, oh, you know, you taught me this, and I'm like, oh yeah, okay, and they kind of remember you, and I was like, oh, that's kind of gratifying. Well, and then also that's at this stage I have a number of PhD students, of course, that I supervised and postdocs, and they're all out around the world doing amazing things, probably a lot more amazing than the things I'm doing, and so there's a personal gratification in that, and it's back to why I kind of really enjoy academia, because that piece of working with people, students, seeing them develop and go on to great things. So that's probably, I don't know if that answers your question, but
it does. No, I love it. It's great. It's a great answer, on the contrary. And then again, we always ask, maybe perhaps you tell us something about yourself that people might not expect.
Oh gosh. Well, I don't know if it's surprising, but I'm a bit of a nerd, I guess, right? So, so I'm always getting slagged at home for the array of coffee machines that I have, and anytime there's a new coffee gadget, I'm like, oh, I'll have to try that. So I'm like, oh, you got to adjust the grind size and all that stuff. So yeah. Anyway, so I've got around 5 different ways of making coffee at any given time of the day.
You're a coffee obsessive.
Well, I didn't think I was until my wife and kids started pointing out.
But I don't think people would necessarily expect that about you. I like it. And then I suppose my very last question, for aspiring students who are really interested in the whole area of electronic engineering, but also kind of decarbonisation and the energy transition, would you have a piece of advice for them?
So one of the things I say to the engineering students and to kind of any students in UCD is, like, reflecting what I said earlier, like, there's a role for you in the energy transition. You don't need to be an engineer to play an essential role in this. So it's going to be an enduring challenge for years to come, whether we like it or not, right? So, please do get on board and get involved. But I guess also I think for young researchers, I would say around patience, like obviously adherence to excellence and quality, but I often think that will require patience, like I talked about earlier with the explosion in the number of publications and, that short-termism, and I can really understand it because I think it's an even harder time now to be an early stage researcher than it was. It just seems to be getting harder, but to kind of stay the course and have patience and believe in that adherence to the highest standards, and that's not easy. So it's easy for me to say it, but I really think it does pay dividends and try and have that more patient approach, if at all possible. You need a supportive supervisor, I guess, as well, and others around you to maybe promote that. Yeah. So that'd be what I would say.
That's a lovely piece of advice. Listen, thank you so much for being with us today. So enjoyable to talk to you, Professor Andrew Keane. Thanks a million.
Thanks very much.